Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about overdraft candidates and specifically which players significantly overperformed last season. This channel in this strategy is all about maximizing value, and players who overperformed last season may get overdrafted and therefore won't return much value for your team if you draft them early. So just an introduction, in order to maximize that value, you have to understand the overdraft and buy low candidates and what that means. Today we're going to be looking at point per game data, which will give us a reasonable look into 3 to 4 offensive categories in one, as players who are putting up points are usually scoring goals, getting assists. Obviously they're getting points and usually getting some power play points as well. It's worth mentioning, though, that before we get into the data, not everyone on this list or in this data set is considered an overdraft candidate or necessarily due for a regression. And basically, this data set factors, there's two basic categories. There's young up-and-comers, guys who are entering into their prime. They're in their early 20s, and they finally come into their own. And a lot of this data is... their 5-year averages are calculated on less data, as we'll see in the next slide. And so maybe they outperformed their 5-year average, so to speak, but they're trending in the right direction. They're young enough where they could potentially follow that up, and maybe they're still in a good situation. That's maybe about half of what the data will tell us in the next slide. The other half is one of these two. So it's either an overproducer, so somebody who had a one-off season way above their average and are likely to regress from that point. And then there's just generally speaking, there's an increase in scoring. So scoring was up last year to 6.3 goals per game. That was up from 5.9 the year before, and most of the 2010s we were at around 5.5 goals per game. So scoring has been up, and that it resulted in 44 point per game players last year. So some of these guys on this list are going to be guys who benefited from that increase in scoring, and maybe they didn't, drastically overperform their usual average. They just overperformed it because of that increase. So as we look at the data, this data set is basically a 5-year point per game average compared with that player's point per game average from last season, just to basically show whether they over or underproduced last year. And just a quick little tidbit, a lot of guys overperformed last year based on the fact that there were more goals, and there's way more players on this list than are on the buy low candidates list, and we'll go into the buy low candidates in another video, so stay tuned for that. But basically, the other thing that you want to keep in mind for this data set, if a player didn't play all the last 5 seasons, the average was calculated based on what we had. So a guy like Trevor Zegras, who's only played 2 years, his quote-unquote 5-year average is a 2-year average, so it's a little bit different, and that's why you see a lot of younger players at the top of this list, because their 5-year averages were relatively low, considering that they didn't put up a lot of points in their rookie year or their second year, and then they kind of took a big jump. So just something to keep in mind as we look at the data. But let's get right into it. Overdraft candidates, these are just forwards that we're going to talk about today. Again, you see some of those younger guys at the top. Kyrou, 1 point per game average, usually a 0.53, but he's seen an improvement every single year that he's played. So he's one of those younger guys that, like Jack Hughes, like Tage Thompson, they're trending in the right direction. Kyrou's only 24. He still may regress a little bit off that number, but he's been trending in the right direction. He had 3 points in 16 games, then 9 points in 28 games, then 35 points in 55 games, and then finally he broke out and had that over a point per game season. So some of these young guys, they may be due for a regression, but by and large, they might be able to actually keep up this production, especially a guy like Jack Hughes. He's had trouble staying healthy, but he's only 21 years old. He's played in 61 games. He had 21 points that year in his rookie season, 56 games the next year, 31 points, and then last year, 49 games and 56 points. So he has trouble staying healthy, but when he's healthy, he's well over a point per game player. And I see that increasing this year because of the amount of players that they brought into New Jersey, and the fact that he's a little bit older and knows the league a little bit more. But in terms of overdraft candidates, we're not looking at these younger guys, Batherson, Troy Terry, Hughes, Kyrou, Thomas to an extent, although Thomas just signed a big deal, the 8x8 deal in St. Louis. I listen to NHL radio quite a bit, and one of their shows, The Point, the host, Boomer, he basically coined the phrase Moneybags syndrome. So it's basically the concept of a player getting a ton of money in the offseason and it weighs down their pants and slows them down on the ice. And to an extent, it's basically they're less incentivized to perform in the regular season, especially a guy who's, on a team that's trying to push for a cup. Maybe they're more focused on the playoffs and just getting through the regular season as opposed to cranking out the numbers and trying to earn their money. And he did just earn a lot of money, so maybe he'd be due for a little bit of a regression. But by and large, these younger guys are still trending in the right direction, and they're going to have, a lot of these guys have the same type of situation. They didn't change teams or anything, so they might still be valuable fantasy assets. The first guy that I wanted to go over in terms of an overdraft candidate is obviously Nazem Kadri, 1.22 points per game. That's really high. And obviously he's going from a Colorado team that won the Cup, obviously. But in that, same vein, he had been there for a couple of years, so he was comfortable in that situation. He was the number 2 center, which was a perfect spot for him. But then McKinnon got hurt, and he stepped up as the number 1 center and was extremely good in that role. And that's where a lot of his production came from, that period where he was getting a ton of ice time. So he not only had everything going for him in terms of his team, his line mates, being in a good situation, but he also got an increase in ice time because of that injury. So everything worked for him last year, and he put up 87 points and was very valuable for Colorado winning that Cup. But going to a new team, just getting paid, Moneybags syndrome again. And then on top of that, new line mates, a new role, playing for a new coach and Daryl Sutter. So maybe a more defensive-minded coach, and he's a very capable two-way player. Maybe he starts to focus a little bit more on the defensive side. There's just a lot of risk baked into taking Kadri very high because you'll see the point totals from last year as you're drafting. You look at the last year's statistics that they usually have, and you'll see, wow, he put up a lot of points, but at the same time, there's a lot of risk in that file overall. A little further down, Nick Scmaltz is not necessarily going to get picked that high, but he's definitely due for a regression. 0.93 points per game. Usually he's a little bit above a half a point per game. I think he benefited from playing with Clayton Keller. Keller a little bit further down on this list. He had a pretty good season as well, 0.94 points per game. Those guys might have just gotten some of the increase in scoring, but they did, they're the 2 offensive guys in Arizona, so they're the guys that are looked at with a little bit more ice time, power play time, etc. So, that could be one of your strategies to try to pick guys off on bad teams that are going to get a lot of time, a lot of ice time, and power play time as well. I mentioned that in my previous video that I did with the mock draft, that Timo Meier was a great pick late in that draft, mainly because if you did that, you were targeting one of the better players on a bad team, and he was close to a point per game guy, and you could have got him in the 16th round. So that's where you could potentially find value, but I don't necessarily see Scmaltz getting highly drafted, so you don't really have to worry about that too much. But you might have to worry a little bit about Nichushkin because he just got a lot of publicity trying to win the Cup. He just re-signed in Colorado, which is a good thing because he's not changing teams, but he did just get paid. He might still get a top 6 role because they lost Burakovsky and Kadri, but again, he put up a really good season last year, 0.83 points per game. That's up from 0.45, his usual average, which would leave him not that fantasy relevant. And by the way, do we forget the fact that Nichushkin went an entire season one time with no goals? He played 57 games in 18-19 and had 0 goals. So he's, kind of seen as a 25-goal winger at this point, but there is a little bit of streakiness to this file, historically speaking. Now, I don't want to say he's going to fall off a cliff or anything like that. He's still in a really good spot, and he's a good player. He's kind of coming into his own now. I think he's 27. But he's, if he gets overdrafted, if you start seeing him in the, the 5th to 10th round range, I don't know if I'd go there. There's probably better options in that range. You might see him and think of the name value from him winning the Cup and try to go there, but I don't know if I would. Ryan Hartman, he's an interesting file, and you see Zuccarello down here as well. These guys are both Kaprizov dependent to an extent. I think Zuccarello is more of an offensive player, even if he didn't have Kaprizov on his line, but Ryan Hartman is definitely Kaprizov dependent. If he's not the center for that line, he's not fantasy relevant. If you see his 5-year point per game, 0.44, that's not exactly fantasy relevant. As I mentioned, you want to be above a 0.7 point per game player, especially in a 12-team league at least. Maybe in a 16-team league he'd be ownable, but this 0.44 average is not great, and then he superseded that by 0.35. He had a 0.79 point per game average the last year, and again, if he loses that spot as their centerman, then that's a really difficult call because he's basically droppable at that point. I don't see him getting overly drafted, though, so that's a positive for his file. But I do see Matthew Tkachuk getting overly drafted, and that's a lot to do with the fact that you get him mainly for points, but also for hits. So him and his brother are always at the top of the league in terms of the draft because they're so well-rounded as fantasy players. I just don't see any way that he puts up 1.2 points per game again. He's probably more of a 0.9 point per game guy, which is still really good. And of course he does get you those hits. So that's also what you're looking for if you get him. I just think that with all the stuff in the offseason, hyping him up and, coming to a new team, everybody thinks it's going to work out right away, but there's a lot. He's just got paid in the offseason, big time, $9.5 million per season. Average, and then on top of that, he's coming to a new team, new country, has to adjust to all the different things that are going to go into playing in Florida. So he's going to get overdrafted. And if there's ever a year to take one Tkachuk over the other, I would take Brady here, just because he's set up a little bit better with that Ottawa top six than Matthew coming to a brand new team. Just something to keep in mind. As we look a little bit further down, Chandler Stephenson, he's due for a regression, no doubt about it. Overproduction last year, 0.81 points per game. And a lot of that had to do with he was basically the number one center in Vegas. And basically when they bring Jack Eichel over and he's healthy, which should be the case now, Eichel's the number one. William Karlsson should be the number two, so that puts Stephenson as the third-line center. So that would be a little bit difficult to keep on your fantasy roster, especially if he's putting up 0.46 points per game. So I definitely see a regression from him, but he's probably not going to get overdrafted too much. But looking right below him, Matt Duchene might get overdrafted. People might see his production from last year, 86 points, 1.1 points per game. The problem with Matt Duchene, he has that 0.75 point per game average, which is not bad, but there's no consistency to his file. And in fact, what was happening, he was regressing every year. So he had a 0.71 point per game, a 0.95, so it looked like it was going in the right direction. Then he had a 0.63 and then a 0.38 point per game average. So he was going down, for 2 years straight. And then last year he ends up with the 1.1, which is a massive jump from 0.38. So almost nobody saw that coming. If you did see that coming, then congratulations, you did an amazing job. And it's something you might want to look for this year. If you see a guy who's been regressing for the last couple of years, but he has name value and he's been close to a point per game average before, you could take a swing on that guy like Duchene. If you did that last year, you would have been rewarded pretty well. But I just don't see him putting up 1.1 points per game again. That's quite a difficult task, even though he still has a lot of the same people in Nashville to work with and nothing has changed. There's just a little bit of inconsistency to his file, so I wouldn't reach too high to draft him. JT Miller, he's due for a little bit of a regression from that 1.23 points per game, but he's still pretty good at a 0.89, and he does hit a little bit as well. And the other thing too is, the opposite of the Moneybags syndrome. He's playing for a contract. He's got 1 year left on his deal, and he's either going to get traded or he's going to get a contract. So that's something to keep in mind. If you're going to go the JT Miller route, I don't see a crazy regression, but a little bit maybe for some of these guys. Johnny Gaudreau, I think that there is a bit of regression there, but he's still a heck of a player. 1.07 points per game, but 1.4 last year. So that's probably due to the increase in scoring and the fact that he was in a perfect situation with Lindholm and Tkachuk there. But both of those guys are not on his line anymore. He will have line A, so he's not going to be dropping off a cliff fantasy-wise, just from the logical standpoint. But I would definitely see him more as a 1.1 point per game guy this year than a 1.4, which still may work for you. Same type of thing with Johnathan Huberdeau. He did just get paid, and he did go to a new team, so there is that risk baked in. He does have some weapons. He's got Lindholm there now, who scored 41 last year. But 1.43 is tough to follow up, and especially when you're not in the same situation that you were before. Looking a little bit further down on this list, Chris Kreider, everything kind of lines up for Kreider. He's still got the same players around him. He's still on that top line. He's still on that top power play. He's kind of learned how to play in front of the net now, and he led the league in tip-in goals last year, and power play goals, I think. I think he still edged him out at the end. Regardless, there's still a top 5 power play, and he's on it. So a lot of good things there. And if you look at his goals per game, over the last 5 years, 0.27, 0.35, 0.38, 0.4, and then a 0.64. So he's trended in the right direction every year. But last year, 0.64 goals per game. That's really, really high. Obviously, he put up over 50 goals. So there's a lot of regression just baked into the goal numbers, though I still think he's going to be a 35-plus goal guy this year. But maybe, the 0.95 points per game, maybe that's a little bit, due for a regression. In the data, there's not a lot to dislike about this Kreider file, but it's just eye test. I just don't see him as a 50-goal guy again. And I'm a Rangers fan. I've been watching this guy for 12 years. We never in a million years thought he would hit 50. Maybe 30, 35 is what we thought. And so that's kind of what I see him as a 35 to 40 goal guy at this point, which is still very valuable for your fantasy team. Another guy to look at, Andrew Copp. He's due for a regression. Last year, when Winnipeg got rid of Line A, he stepped into that top 6. So he got an increased role and took advantage of that. And then that got him traded to New York, where he was on the second line with Panarin and Strome. So he was basically a point-per-game guy playing with those two. And that's where a lot of his production came into play. But now he just got paid. He's going to a brand-new team, and this brand-new team has a lot of new players as well. They did a lot of work in the offseason, so there's a lot of risk baked into that file. He might still have the name value from being deep in the playoffs last year, but he's a guy that I would probably expect a bit of a regression from if we're looking at it. And, he'll probably be a deeper play, not a top-end, pick like most of these guys in this range. But this is kind of, as you go down this list, you get a little bit less risk baked in because these guys are way overperforming their averages, and these guys are slightly overperforming, but usually within a certain range. A 0.2 range is something. A lot of these guys are potentially capable of doing that. Kaprizov, Marner, Rust, Tarasenko. These are point per game guys that are just a little bit up because of the increase in scoring. Another guy that I wanted to get to, Brock Nelson. He's a little bit further down here. He was never a guy that I would necessarily target, but if you look at the file, it's not that bad. 0.81 points per game last year, 59 points, but the key was 37 goals. So, anytime you see a goal scorer above 35 or, in that range, especially as a center that you can probably get deeper in your draft, that's always appealing. But the problem is I just don't see him putting up 37 goals again or that many points again. The season prior to that, 33 points in 56 games, 54 points in 68 games, 53 points in 82 games. So he's in that 40 to 50 range for points, which is, a little bit below what I'd like for my fantasy options. And the thing that would draw you to him is the goals, the 37 goals. And he had a really good season last year. I don't know if he's going to, follow that up with another 37 goal season. He might be a 30 goal guy. But just something to keep in mind, the Islanders offense is never a place that you want to try to mine value out of in fantasy. We'll see what happens with Lane Lambert, with him behind the bench as opposed to Barry Trotz, who like to play defense a lot more. And then the other guy I wanted to mention is Adam Henrique. So, Zegras right here below him, he's trending in the right direction. He only has 2 years of data to compile that 5-year average, but he's trending in the right direction. He'll probably be one of the top 6 centers. And then they just brought in Ryan Strome, so they have 2 top 6 centers. That bumps Henrique down to third-line center, and he's been a career 0.58, 0.6 point per game guy, which is not necessarily fantasy relevant. He could be a waiver wire pickup a little bit later, but he's a guy that is, he put up a decent amount of points last year given the amount of games. He might have been on your team from one point or another. but I don't see him in the top 6 in that offense. I see Zegras potentially taking another jump, but there is a little bit more pressure now that he's kind of entertained the spotlight a little bit more. He's the NHL 23 cover player and all this stuff, so that's usually a bit of a curse, but Zegras is trending in the right direction for sure. And then basically once you get down here, these are guys, the difference is marginal. These are not going to have that much risk baked in. And again, you can play with all of these charts. I leave them in the description below, so you can look at these to find out a little bit more information for yourself before your draft. Another guy I kind of wanted to touch on is Joe Pavelski. Usually a .80 point per game guy, .98 last year. But he may not be an overdraft candidate. He probably won't go too high, but he probably won't be at a point per game. But his stats are pretty good. So he had a .80, a .85. Then his first year in Dallas, he had a .46 point per game average, which was pretty bad. But then the 2 years since, .91 and .98. And that's most of the time playing with Rope Hintz and Jason Robertson. So he's still on that line. He's still going to get those looks in the top 6 for Dallas, and he's still very good in front of the net. So he might be a guy that you'd look at. And he was dual position eligible last year, I believe, as a center right wing, which is obviously more valuable than a single position player. So usually if he's around a .9 point per game guy, and you can get him as a dual position center right wing, he's probably worth picking up in your draft, and may not be an overdraft candidate. Some of these guys, again, the elite guys, these are probably not overdraft candidates. But as you climb up here, Matthews, he's obviously a phenomenal player. I would probably not expect him to put up 1.45 points per game again next year, maybe more in the 1.3 range, just because I think scoring as a whole is going to go down next year. But we'll have to wait and see. He's still an incredible player, and I wouldn't necessarily be scared away from him at this range. Some of these guys, Mason Marchment, I would definitely fade him a little bit. He was in that Florida Panthers offense, and he put up .87 points per game last year because of that. Still a pretty decent player, still relatively young, in his mid-20s, but now he's going to Dallas. His role will probably be similar, a lot of hitting and a lot of getting in on the forecheck and whatnot. But again, not somebody I would go too high on. A lot of his stats are dependent on the fact that he was on one of the best offenses in the league. And then, just some of these guys are younger players that are potentially capable of backing that up. Guys like Batherson, Jesper Bratt, he's going to get you exposure to Jack Hughes, which is something that you might be interested in this year. 0.96 points per game last year. And he was sort of trending in the right direction as opposed to, being a guy that's a career .65 per game player. I think he's only 23 years old, could be 24, but still relatively young and growing into that role. But if you want to look around and play with this yourself, we'll be going over the overdraft defenseman in the next video, and then we'll do buy low forwards and buy low defensemen. So keep an eye out for those type of videos. If you like this type of content, leave me a comment, because I always appreciate any constructive criticism you might have or anything that you like about the videos. Helps me tailor the information to what you need. But thank you again for paying attention. Remember to like and subscribe and share this around with your friends if you haven't done that already. But thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.